Good morning and
Morning,
welcome.
sir. How you doing?
Good, man. It has been a while. Life has got the sad habit of intervening sometimes, but back we are. This has been um, ready for a little while, but yeah, well, we are back now, and hopefully the cadence will keep on going. I'll have to dig in and work on the next episode, I guess, after this.
Speaking of interventions, we're under load shedding. So whilst your big sign behind you saying open for coffee, I can't get any because, funnily enough, on my inverter, the coffee machine doesn't work. I don't know why. It's the strangest thing.
Yeah, that
But to
sometimes happens. That sometimes happens. Cold water for you, my friend. Cold water.
caffeine denied.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think
Indeed.
today, the internet, we've had
The
a
internet.
offline discussions a couple of times, and I mean, the internet has had a big impact on everybody's lives, especially since the pandemic and the lockdowns. So it is really a question of what the internet means for music and hi-fi and some of the holy cows that used to be there from a cultural perspective and a musical cultural perspective, I guess. So,
Yeah.
as my uncle Albert Einstein used to say, he's not really my uncle, but I just like calling him. Um, Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. I think the internet plays part and parcel into that. So let's talk a little bit about this.
Indeed. Indeed.
Something to consider is the meaning of things. Semantics, unfortunately, in today's age is quite important, and people keep on tripping up, including me, on the semantics and what words really mean. So, as an example, I'll use what sounds good and what sounds good to you, and we'll get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty of this. But it's easy. People would say something I like sounds good, but unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. And we'll get into an example shortly. Um, Science and the laws of physics; those are two things that play a big role. So if you stick around, this will get quite interesting real soon. Um, a little immutable fact: cannot test for good sound. We can test according to specifications, but there is no definitive test that will tell us this sounds good. There are things that everybody acknowledges sounds good, and we'll unpack that shortly. Um, how we work is we listen to something and then decide, is this good or is it not good? In other words, I listen to a piece of music and the guitar player's guitar is out of tune. That sounds bad. And everybody will agree that sounds bad. So it is a very, very subjective thing as to the individual's perception of what sounds good and or what sounds bad. As I've said, there are some things which everybody will agree is bad, and most people will agree is good. Um, we can decide as much as we want to on a standard to measure things against, and
Yeah.
we can get other people to measure the same thing and come up with the same conclusion from a measurement perspective.
Yeah.
And we can also agree that if a piece of gear or equipment measures in a certain way, that would not sound good, but it won't sound bad if it measures to that level. Let's use distortion. If it has got 0.002% distortion, everybody agrees distortion with that particular piece of gear is not an issue. If it is 25% distortion, people can start picking up, and I use 25% guardedly. But sometimes people will agree that a bass guitar player on a guitar amp box where the thing is driven into distortion, there might be 50% distortion. And hey, guess what? People like the sound, but it's a lot of distortion. So you get the point of what sounds good and what doesn't sound good. That is a very subjective thing, and we'll unpack subjectivity a little later. If a piano or any musical instrument for that matter is not built according to what we in the Western world, for us, it doesn't mean that it applies equally to other cultures in other parts of the world. But if a piano or any musical instrument is not built according to the recognized and normal standards in the Western culture, that instrument is not going to sound proper or correct. And some people may even say, because they're not used to that type of sound, that it sounds bad to them. It doesn't mean that by definition it sounds bad. It's just to the individual listening. If we are not exposed to a different type of sound, we may disregard that and say we don't like it, we haven't grown up with it, this is foreign, or whatever the case may be. But for the culture where they are used to that, to them that sounds good, and the Western way may sound bad. We don't know how they would be perceiving that. But
Yeah.
the problem is, if we take or rather we enjoy music based on science. Everything in music is based on science. There is nothing in music that is not based on science. The tempos are, the tuning of the instruments are, the frets on a guitar is according to the laws of physics and mathematical calculations to be able to make it sound in a certain way. So the way instruments are designed, the way they are built, to recording technology, to our dear hi-fi as a reproductive means or a means of reproduction, all of those things are based on the principles of the laws of physics. And the scientists and the engineers and the artists and the musicians, they utilize that. Even when you go and study music, you really are studying mathematics and science. There is no getting past any of those. That is just an immutable fact. So this series this far, I think I can say, is not really for snowflakes. I think what we are doing is administering the full dose of whatever it is that we are presenting in every episode. And I would go as far as saying that administering whatever it is that we bring across is undiluted. We are trying to stay factual and truthfully and objectively as is humanly possible. Some things you just cannot be objective about because it is a subjective matter. So I think at this point, it might be a good idea, William, to relate some of the discussions that we've had offline, and maybe a bit more about your experience, what you believe. Yeah.
I think to get our listeners into sort of behind the scenes type what we chat about. And I mean, yes, as much as the instrumentation and our recording techniques and our engineers are all scientific, it still takes a madman in a lab coat to put it all together to envisage what it's all going to sound like once they've done the actual composition. I think, if one considers the genius that was Mozart, how did he come up with putting everything into such a sequence and actually visualize the basis on which he then was able to create the works that he created. I find that amazing, and it's certainly something that I could never do. I can understand to a certain degree, nowhere near in the same realm as you, the technicalities behind things, but for me, it's the ability to create the whole that I enjoy. There's something that I can't do myself, but I can certainly enjoy it. And we touched a bit on the internet in terms of what lockdown brought into sharp relief for me was the fact that we've now sat down and spent time with our music because we couldn't spend time with other people. That may be a good thing for some people, maybe less of a good thing for others. But I certainly sort of re-engaged my love affair with hi-fi and stereo and music, and being alone with family in in one's immediate environment. I would every now and then just boot them out my study so I could just listen to my music myself, and then it was like, wait a sec, I'm going to go into my living room, boot them out there too, and listen to my hi-fi in full blown loud mode. And the internet has changed things, because I think, sort of streaming was, like a bear, but we could access still via CDs and whatever our preferred choice was. But I think that in lockdown, the sheer fact that a lot of people became associated, became, I suppose what the word is, more attached to streaming, I think brought on the advent of this becoming far and far more mainstream. And certainly, maybe I've been accused of being left behind a little bit in terms of my keeping up to date with latest technology. But for me, streaming changed. And when we got to lossless streaming, and we could now listen to CD quality over our internet stream at not even reasonably high speeds. You don't need a lot of data for high-res audio. Certainly not as much as you need for 4K video, for example. So the ability to now access such vast quantities of music at an absolutely lossless format was a big game changer. And we're starting to see all the equipment now filter through into mainstream. I mean, the first streamers and things that came out, I confess, were not great. But the latest generation of stuff that's come through is chalk and cheese ahead in terms of its ability to faithfully reproduce ones and zeros without any loss. And it was one of those things that we talk about, our critical listening. And I found it interesting that I was spending time listening to music and deciding whether what I was listening to was, am I listening for the sake of critically listening, or am I listening with the sake of the emotional attachment to the music that I'm listening to? And so for me, music is almost like a transient anchor. I associate it with memory. So music that was played at a particular point in time in my life reminds me of that particular time in my life when I hear it again. So for me, as I say, it's a transient anchor, and I always reference music to how it makes me feel.
Very
Exactly, and how it makes me feel is deeply linked to how I heard it for the first time, or the second time, or the third time, or that one time when that particular song at that particular point in time was the perfect choice, and how that language of music communication actually fits in at that particular point in time. So when I'm listening critically, I'm always trying to listen to how it sounds on my reference system, as well as how it makes me feel on my reference system. And what's interesting about that is that sometimes it's repetition that kicks in. I cite the example of The Wall. The first time I listened to The Wall, that album by Pink Floyd, that little thing that they threw together at the back of the nightclub one day. And first time I heard it, I remember I was kind of like, it's not what I really thought it would be. And the second time I thought, it's not really what I thought it would be. The third or fourth time, after a few years maybe, life changed. So it's that sort of process where music becomes part of your emotional reference. And so it comes, the questions are, how does this happen? How often does it happen? Is it the system I was listening to at the time, which was not a cheap entry-level system, it was a high-end reference system? Is it the music alone? Is it the universal language that's engineered by someone I'll never meet or can relate to in a studio of some unknown quantum somewhere? Is it mine own ears that do deceive me, as you have alluded to in the podcast that we go through? Is it my own state of mind? Is it my lived experience? Is it my emotional attachments? And the more I read about it, I think it's all of these,
Yeah.
So the technicalities of good systems, of course, are there. The technicalities, the better they are, the more detail possibly we can get out of a recording. We can eke it out of our equipment. But again, it comes down to the fact that equipment can never add or enhance a sound recording. It can influence it or it can change it. That's all it can do. And whether that we perceive as being good or bad is always the open topic in the space that we are. And for me, hi-fi has always been about one thing. It's been about the faithful reproduction of live music. How close can it get to reproducing a sound that I can hear produced in its own environment? And for me, that's the only reference really that we can kind of vaguely try and measure this thing against. And we've talked about it before. You know, you're trying to take an orchestra and replicate it in your living room. It's impossible. It can't be done. How close to it can we get is for me the interesting thing. And that's why reproduction is always in my mind, it's limited. You can never get to the authentic whole. You see, I'm getting emotionally involved because I use my hands a lot, but I become emotionally involved. I've been told to sit on them before.
As we have also discussed on that very point of emotional involvement, the room that we listen in, if we compare that to where an orchestra would be, I mean, it is chalk and cheese. It is vastly different. So it is understandable that we can get better and better over time. And as humans, we always strive to get better, but we will never be able to match that DSP and all of these things. Nonetheless, we can get closer, but we won't be able to get exactly as you've described what you can hear at a live concert.
And that's exactly it. You know, so it's the one great analogy I always had was you're looking through binoculars backwards when listening to hi-fi. That's the equivalent, you know, and it's a question of how far away or how close to that far away point can you actually get. And that's why, you know, reproduction is so interesting. And if you look at like modern music, right? So modern music is a series of tracks overlaid on each other, right? So it's created, it's built up as we go along. And you know, it's a case of, if you take, for example, one instrument in isolation, snare drum, which is what everybody seems to use, or a mouth organ, shouldn't sound the way it should if just played alone. But you've got the studio engineer who's sitting there mastering all these tracks together, you know, and so by the definition of what it is that he does, it's an incredibly difficult job to master. And we have alluded to in the past in the podcast before that, you know, the inputs of where these guys are in terms of modern recordings is enormous. They are the engineers. They are the artists to a large extent in terms of making how a sound is actually going to end up by the finished product when we're listening to it through our systems. Contrast that though against something like a live orchestral piece where his influence is limited. He's not able to overlay all the tracks. He has to record the whole thing in one file swoop. So it's kind of like where my preference for really critical listening lies is in single take recordings of live performances. But again, you know, the nature of the beast is that it's impossible to reproduce. And what I hear and perceive is different to me as to what you hear and perceive.
Absolutely.
And then we touched on cables. I mean, you know, cables, for instance, is such an interesting thing. I mean, because here we go. You know, it's a case of how is it that a cable can influence something? And I don't know. You know, it's one of those things where is it possible to measure what a cable is doing? Yes, it is. Are we measuring the right things? We don't actually know. And how does it go to our listened experiences? And I have to say, I've been listening to hi-fi for a long time, and all my influences around a solid silver cable or a silver plated cable or a copper cable or an oxygen-free copper cable, do I have an inference in my mind as to one being better than the others? I absolutely do. There's no doubt about it. I quite like silver. I quite like silver coated as an interconnect medium. Could I tell them apart from oxygen-free or even just a patch cable? my ego may say I'd like to think so, but in my engineering mind, there's no way. I don't stand a snowball's chance enough. There's no way. Which ones do I buy? Silver ones, of course. I mean, that's just, I don't know. It's just, I think they sound possibly there's somewhere in there, there's something that just appeals to me, possibly because I quite like silver just as a medium in its own. I'm an engineer by background, and I like the properties of silver, and maybe that's colored my influence in my audio listening experience. And again, I mean, it's one of these things where we try and argue over fundamental physics and science in the context of an emotionally engaged listening environment or listening experience. It's pointless. You can't do it. And there's no better argument for me than that vinyl versus digital. I'm not a vinyl fan. I think it's an old compressed format of snap, crackle, pop, and every time you listen to the recording, you degrade it. It's just a fact of simple wear and tear on the physical impacts between the two. So it's a case of for many though, the listened experience of vinyl is just what makes their lives whole. It's better, despite the science and the measured responses and the compression and what have you. And at the end of the day, that's not a debate that's actually worth having, because there are no winners and there are no losers. It's what works for you. And if you enjoy vinyl and that's what gets you listening to music, that's absolutely fine. Because getting bogged down in the technical fundamentals as opposed to, when we think we're hearing what we want to hear versus what we actually hearing, versus the emotional connection versus all the other things that come into our shared listening experience, it doesn't matter. Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? Does understanding the physics, does understanding the science behind it enhance my listening experience, or does it detract from it? And at the end of the day, I absolutely have to say, there's no doubt in my mind that it enhances my listening experience. Without a shadow of a doubt. And I enjoy the fact that I can now, but that I can discern differences between systems, not necessarily good, not necessarily better, but on a personal enjoyment level, is one that I would prefer over the other. And that, at the end of the day, is what hi-fi is all about. It's these little incremental changes that we make that make our experience more enjoyable.
With that, I can absolutely agree, William. That is, you've hit the nail on the head. Now, an interesting thing is there's a couple of points that you touched on, obviously, during what you described, your experience and your emotional attachment and emotional experiences. But there's a couple of things that we can and we are going to definitely unpack within this episode. We're not really going to touch on cables. Once again, we are still steering clear of the cable one. That will be upcoming in the future. But because it elicits so much response from people, I'm still trying to find a reasonable way for us to discuss that without literally pissing off too many people. We are going to, there is no way we can get past that. But be that as it may, we're not telling people what to do with their money, where to spend it, or to not believe if they do believe that cables make a difference. And we're also not asking the anti-cables make a difference people to believe that it does make a difference. That's part of the subjectivity of all of this.
I want to emphasize that point again. It's a case of, as I said, I've done this for a long time. I've listened to probably more cables than most, because getting a set of cables for a review is the absolute worst, because you have no idea what you're going to say that's different about particular cables. And I don't know that I could do a blind cable test and pick up the differences. But I do know that I prefer running my systems with my silver cables. And that's it. I have no justification.
Good enough. And
at all. I like the way that that's it. So it's a case of we're not bashing anybody, and I'm absolutely sure that there are people out there that can hear differences between cables, because as I say, what are we measuring when we're measuring cables? Are we actually measuring something that's measurable that makes a difference on the sound? I don't know. There may be some aspects there that we haven't thought about that span and interconnect to each other that create an influence on sound.
Yeah. William, I'd just like to apologize because of the load shedding nonsense. The session is not very stable and there's some interference in the audio side, but there's nothing we can do about that.
Yeah, so we were just chatting about how it is that, as I say, in my own experience, it's a case of if there are cables on the shelf, I will just grab the silver ones.
Yeah.
So it's just that's the way it's
you don't need any other justification. Nothing needed. Great. So getting back into the rest of the discussion, as I said, we are planning to unpack a couple of the things that you've mentioned. Some of them we have dealt with superficially previously, but we'll get stuck into. So, having mentioned wires, there are lots of places where wires are used, and as I've said, this episode is not about wires, but let's start with a real fundamental one. Electricity reaches our homes via cable, either copper or aluminium cable. Doesn't matter what it is. Fact of the matter is that's how it gets to our places. So even though the voltages and the currents are much higher and different to our hi-fi, it is still a sine wave signal, just having lots more current capability, 60 amps, 100 amps, 200,000, 20,000 amps, depending on where you are. Hopefully nobody's home is consuming that much, but that'll be a few amps on 220 or 240 volt, as we are using in South Africa. So it is exactly the same thing, and everything has been engineered around using electrical distribution, and an amplifier just does exactly the same. It takes a tiny level and it just increases it to 40 volts or 80 volts or whatever the case may be. It's still AC. It's not a fixed sine wave frequency. It's all the musical frequencies. But be that as it may, that's how electricity reaches us. That's how the engineering is done. All the generation of the energy, even photovoltaics converted into AC, nuclear power station generators, hydroelectrics, it doesn't matter, coal, baseload, diesel generators, all of these things, they work exactly the same way. So fundamentally, from a laws of physics perspective, it is exactly the same thing. Frequencies vary, currents vary, and that's about that. But the rest of it is exactly the same. Nobody worries about what cable is being used to bring the electricity to your home. Nobody worries what cable is being used inside the generator at the power station, or what wires are being used from the photovoltaic system. And to take it even further than that, nuclear submarines or any type of submarines, that system is a master system of a number of subsystems, and all of those things creates a very important and life-sustaining system. None of the engineers or the designers or anybody is concerned about the wire that is being used in nuclear or any other type of submarine. Nobody cares about the wires. The only real specification is voltage, current, and fire capability, so that if it burns, that it gives off as little smoke as possible. Smoke is just unburned particles, and it can be noxious particles that and really very dangerous, PVC and all sorts of things. So frequently it's Teflon or PTFE coating that they use on those. And they use hundreds of kilometers worth of wire and fiber optics to do all of these things, digital and analog signals, voice signals, inside all the command information is transmitted over some type of wire. It might be encoded signals or just standard box standard analog for a voice system. It doesn't really matter. The other thing is stuff going into space. Uh, the satellites themselves, they just use good old copper or aluminium wire or silver plated wire, whatever the case may be. Or the spacecraft is exactly the same. It's only the weight of the wire And once again, the ability to withstand fire. Um, I mean, copper and aluminium melts at relatively low temperatures. The insulation melts normally at even way lower temperatures than that. But the only specifications there are what we have known. There is no special space grade copper or wire that is specific from the content of the electrical conductivity perspective of the wire. It's just what's the gauge, what's the weight, what's the insulation, what's the length, current carrying capacity, insulation for high voltages. If there are high voltages, lower voltages, obviously the same thing, but not as critical as the higher voltages. But that is it as far as wire is concerned. So
Yeah.
this episode is not about wire. I've just used it to show what people believe versus what the real scientific reasons are for engineers that make those things work, what their decisions are based around. And none of it is based
Well,
around if it is anything beyond oxygen-free copper or very high conductivity copper. Um, the other things not really important. So why
yeah.
are we talking? And have I used cables as an example in this? Um, it
Wire, wire, bro.
because we want to be controversial? No, because I want to illustrate a specific point. So back to the program and objectivity versus being subjectively thinking about things. So if we go to
Yeah.
dictionary.com and we go and look what the dictionary says about objectivity and subjectivity. So if someone has ever asked you for your objective opinion, what does that mean? That is really meaning that your personal beliefs doesn't come into it. If they say this is entirely subjective, it means it's not based necessarily on fact. That is your experience. Nobody can take your experience away from you. That is just what we have experienced. So subjective versus objective, they are normally placed on opposite sides of each other. They are the opposites in meaning. And if we really go and look at what they actually mean, subjective most commonly means, and I'm reading this so that I can stay accurate, means based on the personal perspective or preference of a person, the subject who is observing something. That is being subjective about something. You see something, and then you think something or you say something, and that is your subjective view of the world. If we, in contrast, look at objective, most commonly means not influenced by or based on a personal viewpoint, but it's based on the analysis of an object or observation of an object only, like the measurement of distortion in an amplifier or the shape of an object in front of you. That is not subjective, that is objective. Everybody that looks at a cube or a Rubik's Cube will see exactly the same thing, and it means the same thing always. So, generally speaking, subjective is used to describe something that exists in the mind of a person or that pertains to the viewpoint of an individual person. So, that's being subjective. It can also sometimes mean the same thing as personal, my personal opinion. Both of those is subjective. Opinion is normally subjective. Everyone's experience of an event is subjective because each person's circumstances and background are unique, and that influences your interpretation of what happened at an event. If, however, we start looking at objective, what that means, in the most of its common uses, objective is contrasted with subjective, often as the opposite. It commonly means not influenced by an individual's personal viewpoint, and it is unbiased. So there is no bias or very little bias because it is very difficult to have no bias about something. That is just human nature, unfortunately. Um, we can attempt to be unbiased, but we are never 100% unbiased, and people sometimes forget that. Something that is truly objective has nothing to do with a person's own feelings or views or emotional state or any such thing. It just deals with facts. When someone says objectively speaking, they're indicating that they're going to give an unbiased assessment, not one based on their personal preferences. So that's the real difference between those two things. Now, there is another elephant in the room, which is confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance.
It's the
Let's
two.
let's deal with cognitive dissonance briefly. That is the psychological discomfort that we feel when our minds have two contradictory concepts. And that's why I used cables. So, your engineering, you mentioned your engineering brain says not a snowball's hope in hell, but you prefer silver plated or silver wire. That is a form of cognitive dissonance. And the way that you resolve that is because you believe it works, irrespective if it does or not. You tend to recommend that cable or buy that cable or use that cable. Nothing wrong with it. That's just fact. So, when in turn the cognitive process makes alternative information to our way of seeing the world have less weight. So, your your emotional experience says silver wire is better than plain copper wire, and to be able to not have that feeling of unease. If you use something else, you prefer to use the silver wire because then you're at ease with the world. You can enjoy the music, you can do critical listening, you can get up in the morning and not worry about is this cable good enough or is it not good enough. So
Yeah.
that is cognitive dissonance. So it will always try and eliminate any inconsistencies that your brain may perceive to be between what you experience, what you see, what you hear, what other people's experiences are, and getting back to your personal belief of something. And your brain will always eliminate that discomfort. And the discomfort we call cognitive dissonance. So that is why uh, I believe cabling and hi fi, which is the only place in the world where this is experienced, really, is such a big deal, and why people get really hot and bothered under the collar if we start discussing cables.
Yeah.
So remember, the displeasure can lead to an attempt to change behavior or defend their beliefs or attitudes, even reaching self deception to reduce the discomfort that cognitive dissonance would provide. Simple as that.
Sounds a bit like politics.
Yes. And remember, in one of the previous episodes, I said um, cabling is and the people's beliefs with cabling is I think it was in the episode where we discussed microphones and recording and all of that alternative energy in music. Um, and we said the belief of audiophiles is really tantamount or the same type of belief system as a spiritual, religious, or political belief. And cognitive dissonance and the research around that certainly bears that out. So um, we can agree that what you enjoy or buy or listen
Yeah.
to is by preference, and it's your individual preference, as you eloquently described with silver cables. Um, it is completely subjective, but there's nothing wrong with being subjective. That is just something in our minds, and we it gives us comfort to not have to fight that laws of physics versus emotional experience issue. And normally the emotional experience will win out over the laws of physics, because it is so difficult to unify those two things, because the one says it's impossible and the other one says my experience with this proves that it must be possible. So therefore I discount the laws of physics and I go with my emotional experience. Nothing wrong with it, just recognize that that is the fact.
Yeah.
So once again, we are talking about cabling, and this is not even a cabling episode. Um, because of objective versus subjective is the fact that we are doing this, or fact versus opinion is another way to look at this.
Yeah.
What sounds good is entirely subjective, as I alluded to right in the beginning. I cannot tell you that what you are hearing is not sounding good to you or must sound good to you because it sounds good to me. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
completely decoupled from each other. Um, because, and I think sometimes people forget that if they enjoy something, other people may not enjoy something, the same thing at the same time. And that may not even be because the other person doesn't like it. It just may be his emotional or her emotional state at the time, which will prevent you from doing that. If you've just lost your job or um, something serious happened in your life, there's not a lot of enjoyment and a lot of things left because you are worrying where the next meal is going to come from.
Yeah.
So that makes a huge have a huge impact and makes a huge difference on your experience and enjoyment of things, and that is very personal, so very subjective, not objective at all.
Yeah.
So we can, I think everybody can agree, and we certainly do from past episodes, that measurements by definition is objective, and it's normally backed by the laws of physics. So if you are measuring something and somebody else takes the same thing with the same measuring equipment and follow the same methodology, you will come up with the same result at the end of the day. That's what engineering is based on. That's what science is based on. That's why we have electricity and hi-fi, and we've got this video podcast on critical listening, as an example, because of those laws of physics, and they work and they are reproducible, and you can measure everything and you can make it work and you can reproduce it and all of those good things. So measurements are, however, not absolute. You can choose to measure one component and not something else, or one um, uh, specific
Parameter.
criteria, yeah, parameter, whatever the case may be, and not something else. And somebody else may do the opposite, and you'll have two different results for the same piece of equipment. So, yes, there is um, some ethics involved in doing some of this, unfortunately, because you can choose to set a specific parameter on a piece of test equipment, and that will give you a completely different result to somebody else. And if you haven't declared it, that is kind of deceiving the person looking at the specifications, which is not normally not a good thing, although there is a lot of that in the hi-fi market, because that'll allow people to charge more for a piece of equipment or a cable.
There was an analogy made, actually, interestingly enough, fairly recently, about, for example, cars. So if you've got a car and you drive from 0 to 100, you can set a stopwatch on it, and you can get the time, assuming that the gear changes are exactly done at exactly the same revs, etc., and then you should be able to consistently get a time. But the point was made that, unfortunately, if you're doing the test up in Joburg, where we have less oxygen per, you know, just per unit volume because of the altitude, you're going to have a slower time. So one needs to actually then allocate an altitude into the mix. And then the point was made, well, that's fine and well, but if you're doing it in the morning, this when the air is colder and a bit denser, you will have a different result again. So you should now set the temperature and the altitude of where you're testing your vehicle at. And then the point is made, well, what fuel is in the engine, what oil was in the engine, and so on and so forth. And that's where I think you're alluding, maybe getting to the point of where it does become a bit of snake oil and mirrors. I mean, overall, the net 0 to 100 of the car is not going to be influenced massively by all of these combinations, but you can massage the numbers a little bit to the point where it might become significant, the differences between the things. And that's as a consequence of the net set of underlying assumptions under which the test was taken. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, is that
Absolutely.
sometimes if you just neglect to mention the fact that you did this car at sea level in the morning with 95 octane, not 93 octane,
Yeah,
you can eke a bit more performance out of it, but you need to expose the fact that's what's actually happening. Yeah.
exactly. And everything is dumbed down so much for the consumer that that goes missing. And I'll illustrate that now. Um,
Yeah.
if we look at consumer audio, the same thing applies, as you said, to cars and to lots and lots of other things. But hey, we're in consumer audio, we're into hi-fi, we consider ourselves audiophiles, or at least some of us do. So we nerd out on all of this stuff. So let me use this as a good good
Good.
example. Um, Operational amplifiers, normally called op amps, and DAC chips are in every piece of hi-fi equipment that we nowadays use, especially op amps. DAC chips are in lots of preamps or amps and in dedicated DAC devices. I've got two of them lying around here, and well, I've actually got three of them, but be that as it may. So let's just look at some of the chips. Let's start with just a normal op amp, and I'll use a Burr Brown, the OPA 134. Now, to give you, and I'll overlay some of the data sheet so that people can see what I'm saying. But to characterize that single little chip, and it's a tiny little device. It's about yay big in size. And there are lots of them inside amplifiers and all of these devices. They are used for a multitude of small signal amplification or buffering, and there's lots of things they're being used for. But anyhow, for Burr Brown to characterize this particular little chip, took them 12 A4 pages on the data sheet to characterize it, and they have used 26 different graphs to depict all the technical aspects and the performance envelope of this little operational amplifier. Everybody does exactly the same thing. So now we have to ask ourselves, if this part is used, and it is used in TVs, in monitors, in amplifiers, in preamps, in sources, everywhere. So if they use this, and it takes 26 pages for the engineers to characterize this, when they use a multitude of them inside an amplifier or a preamplifier, why don't we see any of those things the way that the amp or the preamp is being characterized? All of that is just left out. It forms part, and it is probably the fundamental part that creates the characteristics of your amp or preamp or whatever the device may be. It doesn't matter. Did the amp manufacturers not consider that? Did they not measure all of those things? Did they not bother to pull up the graphs and create the graphs for the amplifier? Or was it just a question of the marketing guys said, nah, sorry, everybody just talks about max output power or max output voltage for preamps or distortion. So forget about those things. You're just going to confuse the consumer, drop all of it, and just talk about a sine wave, max output, single channel driven. What's the maximum output that this thing can provide? Done. Thank you very much. Let's use another chip. And this time a DAC amp chip from Cirrus Logic. It's one of the premier chips that is being used, the CS43131. It's a high performance DAC chip with a headphone driver amplifier already built in. So it's a single device that also provides headphone output, and it's got a built-in amplifier to boost your output so that headphones can use that. So that little chip, not much bigger than the op amp, a little bit more complicated, obviously. But that took 156 pages to characterize that chip. 156 pages of engineering data, and they used more than 70 graphs. I think it is 72 or 73 graphs that they used as part of the 156 pages to characterize this. So for a DAC, I've got 3 different ones here. Not on a single one do you have any of this information available. You can't even get the manufacturer will not provide you what the chipset is that is being used inside and say, so go and consult this particular data sheet if you're really so inclined. If you don't open it yourself, or somebody on the interwebs have done it so that we can see what's in there and we can then look at the data sheet. No, you don't know. You don't even know if the manufacturer has utilized all the best performance out of this DAC chip. If the distortion is the lowest or as low, the rest of the circuitry following the DAC chip does that introduce noise and extra distortion? We don't know. We don't know if they've built that to the same level of accuracy and performance as what the DAC chip is. All right. So that gives you an idea of how much stuff is being dumbed down and how badly really in consumer audio our stuff is characterized. It doesn't bring a lot of confidence, even for hyper expensive pieces of equipment.
Yeah.
So enough of all of that malarkey. We can put that behind us. Let's talk about the internet, because I think that is what the episode really goes about. that
Yeah.
is just background to make this next bit really make sense. 30 years, give or take one or two, the World Wide Web part of the internet consists of different parts, started in 1991. So about 30 years old. The internet itself, the internetwork of computers, which is what the name was derived from, started in 1969. So the first two computers that were interconnected were in 1969. A lot has changed, very dynamic changes, all the time changes. Things keep on being added or being improved, um, like compressed digital storage of any information, audio, video, doesn't matter, just normal textural information. Those are the things that make the World Wide Web what it is today and the internet what it is today. So if we consider information data and data technology, information technology as an example, the distribution um, of all of that information. You mentioned cars just now. I'll use the car as a good analogy. The car was used as a means of dating and mating. We've all been there. We've all been there. Nowadays, that has been wholly supplanted by dating apps on the internet, on the World Wide Web. You don't need a car to be able to date. You can get and I'm talking about a personal car. You don't need one. You can get a Uber, or you can get some of the other means of getting to your date, or you can do a virtual date. That is not always satisfactory, but people do that nonetheless. It gives us a means of reaching out to people. Um, so when we use the car to go to drive-ins and movies, that's another aspect. Now we don't need to do that because the movies comes to us over the World Wide Web. We can watch it, as you said, during lockdown. Streaming became a whole new thing, and that's had another huge change, which we'll discover shortly. We had to drive to work in the past. Now we don't have to. We can use Zoom. I mean, I'm not sitting right next to you. I'm in Centurion, you're in Joburg, and we are having this conversation, uh, real, live, online, using the World Wide Web. That's what's enabled all of it. Getting back to not having to drive to work. So the internet has had a huge influence on everything that we have done for the last couple of years, and it is having an effect on us from a cultural perspective, and not only an effect, it is somewhat creating a new culture worldwide. For the first time, there is an internet culture, and that is literally worldwide. Everybody in the world experiences culture from the perspective of the internet in exactly the same way. Previously, it was only local, but
Yeah.
nowadays with the internet, it is being changed. So that's the influence of the internet on physical transport. So let's have a look at the supply chain in general. Frequently, you can order stuff online. For us in South Africa, sometimes it'll reach us before, because we can order one of an item and have it shipped at a reasonable price. And it'll
Yeah.
reach us in a week, or a bit more than a week, or even sometimes less than a week. Versus if we wait for the local agent, they have to batch and consolidate orders, and it may take 2 or 3 months before that'll actually reach us. I just got to watch the time, 10 minutes, quarter two. Um, so that gives us another way that the internet is changing how we behave, what we do, what we experience, and how we culturally are busy changing. Um, Most production of audio nowadays, as an example, happens in the digital realm. It's not done. Yes, there are people that still does everything uh, in analog mode, um, but that is few and far in between. Everything is done digitally, and there are reasons for it. Not only the mastering and mixing engineers use digital, but the biggest market by a few orders of magnitude is not for hi-fi. That's not what they produce for. They produce for cell phones, for mobile devices, for car radios, any portable device. Headphones is what most people are using. They don't listen on speakers. Think about it from a cultural perspective. The internet allows us to reach out to the whole world and connect with people that previously we could never connect with. But at the same time, it isolates us because if I've got these sorry for that, apologies. When I've got these headphones on, they closed back and nobody can talk to me. I'm isolated. My family is in the house, but they can't talk to me because I can't hear them. If I'm listening to music, I'm isolating myself from the rest of the world. Although I may be listening to music from America, South America, or from Japan, or wherever the case may be, watching a movie from anywhere there and experiencing that culture. Um, the internet is absolutely global and it's got a global reach. News media in the past was very local and very one-sided because they didn't have any insight as to the other side of the news story. Let's take war as an example. Normally, prior to CNN bursting onto the scene many years ago, that was only what the reporter that was in situation behind the firing lines, what their reporting was, and that was very one-sided. Now we've got crews and national state-sponsored broadcasting both sides of the story, and we can make up our own minds, except for censorship, which messes up that whole thing entirely. And thanks to Elon, hopefully something is being done to that. Um, but traditional news reporting and coverage was always biased. Now, there we're talking about bias again. It
Yeah.
had to be biased because it was single sided. It wasn't unbiased because it was the experience and the background and the nationality of the people doing the reporting that got into it. That is why critical thinking is so important. And as I keep on saying, critical thinking is almost more important to critical listening than what critical listening is to critical listening. You have to think about these things, as you said, your silver plated cable. Critical thinking, one thing, experience, something else. Cognitive dissonance and the user's bias. So let's talk a little bit about culture. So culture and influencing of cultures on individuals. There are two parts to culture. There is obviously arts and music, which is the premier thing in which we experience culture. Language is another part of it. But then there is also on the one end that, and on the other end, there is ethics. Now, this is not about ethics. We're not going to make it about ethics. It's just important to understand that ethics is part of it. But we're not going to talk about the ethics of music or of our experiences, only about music and video and arts and how we experience them. Fascinating as it is to see the changes and experience them, before we can record and play back music, it was only possible to experience music live. Either you made music for your family or for yourself, or you presented music in a fashion of a concert or of a local get together, a sporting event. And even in war, music was used all the time in the past. Nowadays, not really, but that's part of the cultural changes. So that created a profound and had a profound impact on people's culture because we got together, we drank, we ate, we had conversations about various things. We listened to music, and it then escalated into where there are concerts that people made money out of, and for the benefit of whomever went to the concert. That's a cultural experience. Um, a most enjoyable cultural experience for lots and lots of people. Um, I have got a massively big, because I grew up on a farm, personal space. So to me, that is frequently frightening to go to massively big concerts, and I try and not do that. I have done it from time to time, but that's just my experience. I can't help it. That's just the nature of what
The
made.
best part. we must encourage you to come to more live concerts.
That's going to be exceptionally difficult. Be that as it may. This experience formed a lot of our cultures in the various parts of the world, individual cultures, individual types of music, etc. And that effect is slowly busy changing, and it has to change because the only thing that we've got in common nowadays is, and during lockdown there were none of that, and streaming took over, as you mentioned, because of the fact that we couldn't go anywhere, and we were restricted from interacting with other people, and that by definition also changed our culture. And at this point we're going to be kicked out of the session, so I'll reset the camera and I'll rejoin the session again.
I'm going to make a cup of coffee.
Right, so talking about the cultural changes we are experiencing.
I just wanted to touch on that because whilst you were rabbiting on about it, you make some very interesting points there. And the natural resolution of this is that, when we look at music throughout the ages, it's gone from being mass down to personal. And when I say mass, the only way you would access music within a couple of 100 years is en masse. You would not be able to listen to it unless you were a king and you had your own private audience. And that all changed with the advent of the much maligned vinyl record, which enabled people to have music within their own environment. And all that's happened subsequent to that with the revolution, and that was the revolution of vinyl, is devolving down now to where we have cordless headphones in our headphones and our ears, I beg your pardon. And as you say, the cultural shift is remarkable because now we can choose to listen to exactly what it is we want to listen to. We have access to a range of music far surpassing anything humanity has ever experienced before, and growing at an exponential rate. I think sometimes based on some of the nonsense I hear my kids listening to. I just overnight turned into my grandfather. How can they listen to that rubbish? And then I realized some of it is actually my own music that they're listening to. So we talk about confirmation bias. You can't get stronger than that.
You can't.
And you're right. The internet, in terms of the changes that it's had on our culture, very hard to measure or assess, but the fact that they are here and the fact that they are permanent and the fact that they continue to unlock new changes and new impacts on our culture and on a global scale, not necessarily just on a local scale now,
Yep.
is significant.
It is so fascinating to see the changes outside of my own little private.
I got my coffee.
Exactly.
Power's back.
Power is back. The internet should be a lot more stable for us poor folk here on the receiving end of the utility we love to hate issues, but be that as it may, I'm also experiencing exactly the same, and most people are, but we just don't cognitively think about the experience of the culture and of the World Wide Web on us. Before we could playback, as you said, before we could record and playback music, it was only en masse that we were able to experience it, except if you were one of the royalty or a very, very rich individual, of which there are very few. So in the bigger scheme of things, anyhow, that created the culture as we have been used to it over millennia. But now that culture is busy changing, and I am a firm believer that the internet is having a massive, massive influence on everybody in the world's culture at the moment. For the last 30 years, and as you said, when vinyl came along and we could distribute the music, it became a more personal and a more isolated, more individual tailored experience because you could select whatever you wanted. But just like you buy your car, you bought your music. You owned the music. You had a copy of it in perpetuity, except if it's vinyl, as you said, because it degrades over time. CD media doesn't degrade to the same rate, but the actual physical media can. Digital files don't degrade, as you rightly said. Digital versus vinyl, we have solved that problem a long time ago. But for some people, that didn't solve their experience of the cultural aspects and the emotional aspects of whatever they enjoy.
Yeah.
Some people, myself included, I still enjoy vinyl, but I also stream. I've got multiple decks. I've got multiple streamers.
Yeah.
We all do that. I, by rights, I should not like digital because I didn't grow up with it. But hey, I adopted digital. Um, I adopted streaming. I have been streaming for a fairly long period of time. Nonetheless, the profound effect on culture is indisputable. Of in the last 30 years, what has happened to people's culture and the influence of the World Wide Web on that cannot be disputed. Let's discuss another little bit. Um, because of digital content and digital distribution, nowadays with streaming, you don't even own the music anymore. It's a
Yeah.
service. You pay a monthly fee or a yearly fee or however you select to do that. And imagine the influence of that. You don't go to a cabinet, and I've got one here with DVDs and CDs on my left-hand side.
Yeah, so do I.
The one with a little lion above my head over there, that
Yeah.
cabinet is there's some wine in it, and the rest is CDs and DVDs on the sides. Uh,
Yeah.
I can't really move much out of the way, but there you can see one of the CD doors. There's another one on the other side. Um, that's the stuff that I own. But it doesn't
Yeah.
matter if I own them because I can also stream them. And there's a vastly bigger selection of things that I can stream in comparison to things that I own. So I've got a much broader access to whatever it is that I want to enjoy. And as I
The
said,
library got massive.
absolutely.
It became global. You literally have access to a global library.
I've now got access to other people's playlist, which is just a
Yeah.
virtual collection of data which contains the digital music that I can select to stream. I can build my own playlist. My own playlist. When Apple came along with the iPod and later the iPhone and iTunes, that was a big revolution because you could own music that you could buy digitally, download it, own it, and that became your playlist, all the stuff that you own. You could break it up into different playlists with different genres and different whatever. If you out running a marathon, you could take it with you and you can listen to your running playlist if you wish. If you went out fishing and you don't want to listen to nature, you could listen to some music. If you're having beers with friends, or a braai or whatever the case may be, you add a different party playlist or a braai playlist or whatever the case may be.
Exactly.
So now you can still create those, except you don't own the media. And that was the next very big thing. And Spotify was leading this on the World Wide Web. That was a very, very big sea change going from owning the music to just listening and paying for the privilege to have access to 80 million or 100 million different songs somewhere on a server in the internet. So
Correct.
that is a massively big change because now you can literally hone down and listen to a very narrow selection, but have a very big choice within that very narrow selection. And here is the thing, you can have multiple ones of them.
Correct.
If you sign up for a family version, you can have 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 different playlists in a family of four quite easily as
Yeah.
people build up their playlist over time. They
100%.
can overlap and multiple people can listen to the same thing all at the same time, but all in
And
isolation.
and the next sea change is where you don't even need to bother with that because the AI already know what your playlist is.
They've got a pretty good way of figuring that out. Now,
The algorithms are becoming quite sophisticated these days,
pretty darn
and
good.
and scaringly accurate sometimes. When I listen to some of my music, I was kind of like, they got me down.
Absolutely. So one of the big changes that the internet brought was private sharing of music. And that was like it raised red flags to musos, to record labels, to distributors of music, because suddenly I could take whatever I had and I could share it privately with you, and nobody knew about that. And
Yeah.
the World Wide Web enabled that. So then everybody, including Apple, scrambled, and Spotify eventually, and all the record label companies scrambled to figure out how do we enable people to buy digital copies of our music online. So that was the first step. Apple was leading that. Then the record companies followed. And then Spotify came along and said, let's not sell it. Let's just lease it as a service. And those were the very, very big changes. Okay. So now we can see the effect of the internet and the World Wide Web more specifically on music and via music and video, movies, things like that, on our individual cultures. So the culture became more similar around the world because of this single service called the World Wide Web and its influence on our local culture and how we now go about listening, consuming, enjoying music, video, and art. A massive change, a massive change.
And the inference of that is even more, well, from my point of view, even more interesting in that very recently I was having a chat to a fellow journalist, very much younger than myself, and I said to him, what do you think of these wireless headphones? And the point was made that these ones are better than those because they sound clearer, because. And I said, what about the bass response? What about the trebles? What about the mid-range? What about the smoothness? What about the harshness? And it was like, I hadn't really thought about that. What I said, what makes it sound better to you? And in that moment, you sort of see the lights coming on, and it's kind of back to the day where you're sitting down with your good friend who's never listened to a high-end audio system before, and you play him a set of BMW 802.X's million rand for a pair of speakers, and you crank it up, and the guy goes,
Whoa.
It's that moment.
Yeah.
And my lead to that was, and what do you listen to when you don't have these plugged in? And it was, I'm actually thinking of buying a hi-fi. I'm kind of like, yay, the convert, we're going to get there. Exactly. So, far from it being a doom and gloom that, the age of the hi-fi is over and dusted, I think we're at the beginning of a new age of it.
We will.
Stereo is coming back in a massive way.
It'll be different to what it was in the past, but that's
sure. I agree.
It doesn't matter.
But, no doubt, exactly.
It might not be stereo, it might be Atmos, or it might be something else again, surround, multi-channel, whatever the case may be, but still that is hi-fi. And that is one way, at least culturally, that we enjoy. If we are having a braai and watching rugby and having a few beers, everybody is not standing around there with headphones on.
Correct.
No chance. That doesn't
Correct.
That will be speakers and some form of hi-fi. Or it might just be television speakers. It doesn't matter, and it might be low quality, but that is culturally not acceptable to be amongst people and have these on. We just don't do that. Culturally, that will stay not acceptable, which is a good thing. Otherwise, we lose our culture completely.
I sincerely hope you're right. It may come down to we all got the same earphones, we're listening to the same music, but it's going to no, I can't see that happening.
No. In a restaurant, people sitting next to each other, chatting on their cell phones, taking pictures and taking selfies and things like that. I still frown on that. I don't believe that's the thing. We've got for family, if we're sitting around a dinner table, there is there's a ban on electronics at the table. That's family time. We do that. If you want to do online stuff, you do that at a different time. You don't do that and we don't sit in front of television or anything. I don't have a television, but that's a different story. So the cultural shift, traditional media, LP singles, which are now mostly unobtainium, you don't really get them. You still get LPs. Fortunately, CDs are getting more difficult to find because of streaming and of all the changes that the World Wide Web has brought us. So if we look, remember we had a discussion. No, I don't know what that
Oh, you're back. No, you're
other
back again.
camera that's doing this. This load shedding is not good for the device. But anyhow, let's get back to this one. If we think we discussed shortly prior to that Johannesburg cabling test that I've put a separate video out on, which was quite insightful. But anyhow, prior to that, the two of us discussed maybe looking into a hi-fi club up in Johannesburg like they've got down in Cape Town. We actually had a somewhat online and somewhat offline discussion on that. And at the Joburg cabling event, one was actually formed by a couple of people that was there. So that I believe is kind of not a cultural kickback against the World Wide Web, but getting back to being amongst like-minded people when it gets to hi-fi and enjoying the music and the experience and nerding out on the equipment and whatever else it is, but being amongst friends where we can discuss. We don't have to agree on everything, but at least discuss and enjoy and experience what other people are experiencing at the same time they are. So that's a reason why this was done. You were publishing a magazine prior to the lockdown periods, which evolved into your online because of the lockdowns, and whatever other reasons there may be. But that was kind of, or a form of, a physical paper-based published club of people that used to enjoy what other people's views were and what they were sharing, and they could share that amongst themselves again.
See what was there. Yeah.
Exactly. There were physical shows that the distributors put on for us, where all the latest and greatest gear were put up in a central location, and 2,000 or 20,000 people flocked there over a weekend and made decisions to buy or just to listen or just to see what was new.
Yeah.
We've lost a lot of that, and hi-fi clubs in that realm at least is a way of getting back there.
Yeah.
So live streaming of concerts, that's another thing that nowadays happen. Live streaming of church services, it's something else that happens. That has got a huge influence on our cultural experiences. Social media is another way that the World Wide Web decided, or someone on the decided to create a service like that. And just look at the reach and the impact of things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and all of these things, Telegram, all of these services. Some of them are free, some of them are sponsored, supported by advertising. Some of them are subscription services like Spotify or Tidal music streaming, or YouTube music, or whatever the case may be. Amazon, which will hopefully be with us next year, which will make our lives a lot better. You mentioned AI and all of those things. We're not going to discuss AI, but AI is to a large extent, and bots to a large extent is a phenomenon of the World Wide Web.
100%.
That was a huge enabler for artificial intelligence, because it is important to have big data sets to be able for AI to be able to do what it does. And the World Wide Web enabled a lot of this.
Yes.
So this cultural change, the internet, World Wide Web, is now not just changing our culture, but giving us new cultures, new experiences, which previously, without the internet and the World Wide Web, was just absolutely not possible. It couldn't have existed. So that is having probably an unintended consequences of changing culture, because I don't think anybody that created the internet created it with a view of changing people's culture. None of these services did so either.
And just to draw it back to what it is that we're about, this interaction involves primarily two senses: the visual and the audible. And it's that is, for me, the exciting part, in terms of the fact that half the experiences that are now still coming are going to be built largely on the audiovisual interface. And the audio side of things, as we have been going through our podcasts and as we've been talking about how our brains are able to be fooled by the way audio waves are reconstructed, I think is so interesting, because the 3D immersive virtual world that is being talked about and prophesied and whatever it is, as you say, it's coming.
Yep.
And for us, the audio files, we need to be convinced. We need to have good quality to be able to pick up the fact that the stuff is now actually at a standard that we can accept. And that this is what I find so interesting.
Absolutely. You once again are spot on in
So
summarizing this.
so
We're almost done here. So
I'm sorry.
this cultural change in the internet and the World Wide Web that's giving us this new culture and providing a huge influence on what it is that we do and experience. Everything nowadays is available as an app on your phone or on a
Yeah.
mobile device of some type. So there is almost nothing is sacred that can't be done there. Fortunately, at the moment, there is no such thing as smelly vision yet, but I guess TV vision, that might happen in the future. We don't know. But be that as it may, I'm glad, because if you haven't had a shower for 2 days, I think it is going to turn people off watching the video if it's smelly vision. So that might be a good thing that it hasn't been done yet. But if we really consider the mobile device is our view and kind of the portal to the new culture that we are experiencing ourselves and everybody else around the world. Yes, there are slight differences, but by and large, the cultural experience is the same if you experience it from the same type of mobile device, whatever that mobile device may be, if it's a cell phone or a doesn't matter what it is, really, a laptop or something. But
Yeah.
the internet is delivering, and the World Wide Web is delivering the bulk of this cultural change that we are experiencing. The internet, therefore, has to mean a lot to a lot of people. And if you consider that the bulk of the world or a large part of the world is still not enabled to have any of these experiences because of various reasons, be it political, be it financial, be it cultural, it doesn't matter. There is a huge swath of the world which still do not experience this type of cultural change. That is neither a good nor a bad thing. That is just a thing. Some parts of the world experiences this, and other parts of the world just simply don't. So if we look at the culture of group listening as it has been in the past for the whole world, that is nowadays mostly resolved for big concerts or big events, big sporting events or big whatever event it is, it doesn't matter. That is still something that people do. And sadly, even if we consider funerals, which is a necessary part of life, we all have to go there. But even that is a cultural event and a cultural experience. We know what lockdown has done to that in most of the world, to funerals and how that was locked down and the sad effects that had on people, because sometimes people couldn't get to their family to participate in having their final goodbyes. This is a very somber note, but I think it is part of the culture. Um, the cultural change that is happening and the internet that delivers that simply means, while the internet brings the whole world and everybody in the world together, at the same time, it also sadly isolates us. Look at the headphones that I've discussed. So, although I've got access to all of that, and the two of us are communicating, and we can add more people to the podcast, and for a brief period of time, the blink of an eye, we have some interaction. I can't properly greet you. I can't give you a hug if I so desire to do that, but at least we have face to face virtual interaction. We can together experience a concert, and I don't have to stand in a crowded venue. If I don't want to do that, if I
Yeah.
so choose, I can go and do that. The experience is vastly different. I'm not saying experiencing it virtually is the same as physically. It just is not. But that may be a bridge too far for some people like myself, where I don't enjoy that experience. I just simply don't. Um, but it is still a way for us to participate. I mean, um, I'll mention Rodrigues. For one of my birthdays, my wife wisely decided, because I grew up with Rodrigues. Um, the first time that I heard that was, and it was on LM Radio in 1972. My brother picked me up, my oldest brother. He was already out of school and working. He picked me up. We went to a neighbor's farm. Um, we helped them with a watermelon harvest. And I'll never forget, we had some of the fresh watermelons there. We ate some watermelons, and he switched on 702 in his car. And one of the first songs that I experienced, um, it just blew me away that I could suddenly listen to all of these things outside of opera, which was the only thing my parents listened to on the radio. And I didn't realize I was, I mean, in standard four, standard two, which is grade four nowadays.
Yeah.
At that time, I didn't realize that you could have tune into anything else than church on a Sunday morning. And if we didn't, if we, if my dad couldn't go to church because we had stuff to take care of on the farm, animals or whatever, or the river was flooded and we just simply couldn't get to town. Um, that experience of that day, I'll never forget it. I mean, it is to me as crystal clear today as it was back then. And that emotional connection with LM radio at the time and the music that I heard was
Cool.
something to change my life forever. Emotionally, that changed me profoundly. Then I discovered there were other things on the radio, and then I begged my dad, because that was part of what he did. He repaired radio, so I then begged him to get a radio, which I eventually got for myself, and I could then start listening to all these radio stations. Uh, Even way back then, that's how I started in music. And then when Rodrigues was so popular in South Africa, that had a profound effect on me. And the whole rediscovery, and then my wife decided she'll book a concert for me, and we went to watch him. And that was absolutely, for me, divine to be able to experience him in person because of my emotional connection from way back when he was popular on the radio in South Africa. So
100%.
that is the type of cultural changes that the internet is bringing. And the internet was instrumental in some of the local South Africans being able to find the poor guy and put him back on the map and get his music out in the world, and made videos and movies about him and the whole ordeal that he went through. So
Exactly.
although the internet does bring people together, it also isolates people. Like I said, that's not good or bad. That is just the way that culture is changing for the worse or for the better. It doesn't matter. That is a perspective and a subjective thing. That is, there's nothing objective about any of this discussion. But the internet is really bringing a cultural revolution, and it has a very big influence on our lives and our music and our cultures. And with that,
Without that.
anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you nailed it. I think it's exactly that. And our, our our role is, sort of, as we critically listen to this, is to establish the context, and that's primarily what I think we're doing here. And for me, it's always interesting. I go back to the fact that, yes, whilst the title algorithm is particularly good and has me nailed, I also try to confuse it every now and then by going listening to some Tibetan throat music, courtesy of Mr. Richard on our site, who has broadened my horizons, and it's you would never be able to do that before. Just you wouldn't even know, as you said, that it existed, much less had a means of communicating with me sitting in South Africa, about as culturally removed as it's possible to get from them. And that for me is tremendously exciting. And as you say, when we've got the internet both isolating and bringing us together. The changes in our culture are going to be interesting to watch and see as they transpire, and how we consume our music. I mean, it's just so exciting.
Yeah, load shedding is really messing with my cameras. No idea why, but here we are. All right. Well, I think we can.
On that note, we can leave it. Yeah, very interesting discussion. Thank you, Sarah. Loved it.
Till next time, and I'll let you know when we get this published. But thanks again. I think this was
all right.
episode.
This was great. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah,
thanks,
lovely.
William.
All right, so
Well,
have a good day further.
and the same.
Ciao, ciao. Bye.